ability to use tools. And corvids in general, corvids are the class of birds that crows and ravens and blue jays all sort of fit in. And they're pretty well known for being pretty smart little birds. There's another story about crows, not these Caledonian crows, but a different group of crows in Asia, where we've seen kind of a cultural evolution, they'll call it, but basically a learned behavior that's happened where a few crows in one city learned that if they dropped a really hard nut that they can collect from the wild onto streets, cars will drive over them and crack the nuts for them. And then they fly down and they eat them. And this just sort of happened and started in one little city in Asia. And what has happened is over about 10 years, it's spread across the entire continent. So like, maybe not the whole continent, but at least, you know, across a large swath of area, because these crows are just picking this up. They're learning from each other. They're seeing each other doing it. And now they're just sort of replicating that behavior all over. And it's a learned thing. So they're seeing other individuals doing it. These crows are really interesting because in the wild, they seem to have learned/evolved, and I'm sure there's a little bit of both going on there, the ability to use tools to basically function as woodpeckers, because in their native habitat in Caledonia, there are no woodpeckers, and so they're sort of taking advantage of that niche by using these little sticks to stab and impale grubs that they then pull out of crevices. So they're pretty clever little guys. So that's a neat example of a really clever bird. The puzzle is, why is it that some animals are so darn clever? And in some cases, there seems to be a fairly clear explanation. At least in the case of the Caledonian crows, the argument has been that they've been, that selection has favored the cognitive skills of these animals in terms of their tool use, because it allowed them to exploit an ecological niche that wasn't exploited, that there weren't woodpeckers cruising around grabbing grubs out of logs, so they kind of learned/evolved cognitive skills that permitted learning in order to exploit that niche. Another explanation that's been put forth for why some animals seem to be very intelligent versus others is what sometimes is called the social brain hypothesis, and that's demonstrated over here with these little hyenas. What the argument with the social brain hypothesis is that the challenges that are associated with living in a complicated social environment, that's the thing about social environments. If you're living in a big troop of hyenas, it's a complicated environment. You have to remember individuals, because individuals have different hierarchy or different dominant statuses. And if you don't remember them and don't show appropriate subservience to the dominant individuals, you're going to get your butt kicked, for one thing. So it's important to be able to remember social status. It's important to be able to just handle the complicated things happening in your environment, because a social environment tends to be much more chaotic than a just nice, monotonous, solitary environment where you don't have to deal with that kind of chaos all the time. So the challenges associated with social behavior may drive cognitive skill evolution. And so the prediction from this is that social species should have larger brains, and they should have more developed social cognitive skill capacity than individuals that are more solitary. And this is an example of hyenas. So in this case, these are two spotted hyenas, and spotted hyenas are a highly social group. We're going to talk more about them later on, because they're weird in all kinds of really bizarre ways, and they're really interesting for those reasons. But just for now, know that they're a highly social species, and they're really good at doing tasks that require cooperative puzzle solving. So in this case, they rigged this little feeder system where the only way in order to get food to come showering down on them is if both of them tug on the rope at the same time. And hyenas, if you just put them into this environment for the first time and they've never seen the ropes, it really doesn't take them very much time at all to figure this thing out. I mean, they can kind of smell the food. If they both pull on the rope, they get the food, and these guys perform this task, when it's a novel circumstance, they're able to perform that task pretty quickly. Compared to other species of hyenas that are not social, if you put them in the room, they have a much harder time, or it takes them much longer in order to solve this puzzle. Similarly, if you compare across other species, if you just look at brain size, for example, and compare across bird species or mammal species, and look at social versus non-social relatives comparing across species, you tend to find that individuals that are social tend to have larger brains, and there's other kinds of cognitive tests that people have done that have supported this idea that social interactions may drive cognitive development. One kind of neat case where you may have sort of cross-species social interactions involves domesticated dogs. So dogs, I think, dogs are really interesting because while clearly they're descended from wolves, and you can see a lot of commonalities with wolves in terms of their behavior and their dominance hierarchies and how they sort of, how their minds work in terms of how their social constructs work and the pack idea, they clearly are not wolves now, right? I mean, they have evolved, and oftentimes due to artificial selection, but they have gotten very good at living with humans. In a lot of ways, that's really what dogs have done so well, is that they have found this little ecological niche, if you will, of coexisting with humans, and doing things that humans find rewarding, and then they get food and shelter as a result of this thing. I mean, you know, we have a dog, and I guess I've mentioned I have a somewhat adversarial relationship with our animal, but I recognize that lots of people like dogs, and I'm not, you know, knocking the dogs, but this is, you know, this is kind of how they make their living, right? Is they live well with people, and they give love and delight, and as a result, they get food and shelter and, you know, reproductive opportunities. So one could ask whether or not, I mean, it's certainly clear that humans have selected for certain traits. That's why we have different breeds of dogs. But it could be also that just the fact that they live with humans has favored those dogs that are best able to understand and interact with humans in a productive fashion. So one of the predictions that has come with this is that dogs may have evolved better capacity to understand human signals, be they intentional or unintentional signals. So here's an experiment that was done, and I'm sorry, the screen, somebody was messing around with my projector, and so the bottom of this thing is cut off. Maybe you can kind of make it out. But basically, there's a woman standing here, and there's supposed to be 2 food bowls, one on each side of her. And in this case, you can see she's gazing at one of the food bowls and pointing at one of the food bowls. And so in this experiment, what they do is they have a dog or a wolf sitting there with someone else across the room, and then they have the human, bless you, pointing at one of the bowls and staring at one of the bowls, or just, and I mean, that's one of the things, is she can be pointing. Another thing is that the person can be staring at but not pointing. Or the person could be neutral and just basically looking straight forward. And so what they do in the experiment then is they watch where the dog goes. There's 2 food bowls. And so they watch and look to see which of the 2 food bowls does the dog or the wolf go to first. And in this experiment, what you can see is that when the human is either gazing at the target or pointing at the target, when they looked at dogs versus wolves, they found that dogs would go to the correct food bowl, the bowl that was actually indicated and actually had food in it, more often than the wolves would. And this is indicative that the dog is somehow is paying attention to where the human is gazing. Okay, so this is sort of a cognitive skill that the dog has where it's paying attention to the signal in its environment. What is that human doing? The human's staring at the food bowl. I'm going to go check that one out. Similarly, if the human points at the target, dogs more reliably went to that food bowl than wolves did. And then if it was neutral, so if the human was not doing anything, then there would be roughly sort of a 50-50 shot, and the dogs were performing no better than the wolves were. So this was indicative and supported this idea that dogs have specialized ability to pay attention to food. Pay attention to food. That didn't make any sense. Dogs have specialized ability to pay attention to human signals so that they can get to food. I will say there has been subsequent criticism of this work. There's a whole back and forth literature on this. There's a lot of concern about whether or not the dogs and the wolves had equal upbringing, and therefore, like if you raise wolves as a pet and the wolf grows up paying attention to humans, is it more likely to respond appropriately than our dogs? I think in this particular study that there's been several versions of this study. In this particular one, I think these were wolves raised by people and dogs raised by people. So the environment was roughly the same between the 2 groups of organisms. But like I said, there is some controversy about the study. It's still a neat little study, though. Any questions about anything like that? All right, so what I want to do now is turn attention to the homework. Have you guys pull that out. And as usual, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time to sort of pick your way through it. I will assign questions momentarily, though, and then we'll talk them out. Into their predators' mouths, provide a proximate explanation and an ultimate explanation. I think this went to Kristen. What did you get for proximate? What did you put for ultimate?
I had two.
Okay.
First one I had because of the dorsal spine, like a fish must be facing head first. So when they have to suddenly turn, it changes where their head's positioned. So they can potentially avoid attack.
Right. Okay. So they're so the fish is swimming. What is this? Let's start here. What is the disturbance? I think I'm following what you're saying, but. Yeah, so like the first thing that happens is not his head moving, right? You have to like watch really closely. I don't know if... But like, oh, come on. Now let's watch it again. So, I just wanted to see, okay. So, if I hit the play button, watch right there. So he kind of moves this first. So if the fish is thinking the disturbance is coming from this direction, and it swings around so that its spines are pointing up the wrong way, I mean, that would usually be it's probably ready to swim away, but it's also like getting those spines kind of ready to oppose gulping, I think is what you're saying. I like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so grouping and herding and schooling types of animals, this seems to be one defensive mechanism, is that if they're all kind of right together and they're all kind of moving as one, so they're responding to similar cues, then it does make it harder to track one individual. And that certainly, like you hear about, like zebras, for example, are really good at this, because they also introduce a disruptive coloration that makes it just hard to like track one individual if you've got all these black and white stripes around. So the predators, the idea is the predators like going into this herd, and there's just chaos, and individuals are changing direction as one, and the result is it's just hard to track any one individual. So they're like everywhere, but you can't focus on one, and therefore you just don't end up nailing it. I like that idea. Other ideas for either proximate or ultimate explanation? Yeah, so I think I kind of like this one, although I think you're kind of swimming. I would probably rephrase this because I think it's more like here. I mean, look, it looks to me if the first movement is that little bump of the thing, I'd probably say it's swimming away from the disturbance. Swim in the way from. Sorry, I'm changing your words on you. But I think this makes sense, right? So if the normal thing the fish does is that when it encounters a disturbance, it swings around so that it's harder to swallow. It's also ready to bolt and swim away from that disturbance. So in this case, it's sensing disturbance coming from this way, and so it turns, and oops, and the snake just happens to be right there and ready to gobble them up. So most of the time, I think an argument might be, well, so from an approximate perspective, this is what's happening, is you have this sort of escape behavior where you're orienting yourself in a defensive position away from disturbances in the water, and you just do that. So from an approximate perspective, I think this makes sense. From an ultimate perspective, we're saying that, this is orienting so you're harder to consume. I think it probably most of the time, if you're orienting away from a disturbance in the water, you're probably also orienting, away from danger, and so you can hopefully swim away from danger most of the time. It just isn't working here, right? So like in this case, this snake is sort of taking advantage of the fact that most of the time animals swim away from disturbances, and it's got this clever little thing. It's not that the snake itself is clever, it's that this behavior has evolved in this animal. It probably doesn't even know what it's doing. It's just this is how the things hunt, and they happen to have a little twitch before they strike. So in this case, I'll just sort of add, fish usually benefits by turning away from and swimming from disturbances. Just not this time. Right? So most of the time, this is an advantageous thing. It's just, it won't always work out for the poor fish, and that seems to be what's happening here. All right. We good on this one? Is that any questions on it? Kind of enjoy them. All right, let's talk about code breaking. So I sent you to an article that was about some of these same lycaenid blues, but these guys are a little more sinister than the ones we talked about in the video. So it does say here there are 2 examples of code breaking by these larvae in the article, and it says to describe each. So Angela, you got tapped for this one. I totally got behind on your words, so I'm just making stuff up now. But this is of the queen ant, right? And so as a result, it gets provisioned. And yet, so it's code breaking, and yet these guys are going in there and just like munching away. They're little predators. They're horrible. Okay, so given that they are being exploited, why do you think ants have an evolved resistance to these signals? So this one's kind of speculative, but Allison, you got this one. What'd you put? Okay. So I think in this case, I think these are not, I don't think these caterpillars do that secretion thing. Unless I missed it in the article. Certainly the video one we watched, that's, there's a clear benefit, I think, to the ants, and so there's a nice little mutualism. I think in this case, these are just straight up predatory bastards, so they're just munching away on the larvae. But yeah, there is this issue where they're unaware it's happening, so there's they have limited ability to detect this. So you can, I wrote, they have limited ability to detect the caterpillars because they're using the same communication system used by the ants. And most of the time, I think this would be an argument you could make, which goes along with why is it so hard to detect that, and why are they unaware? Most of the time, this communication system works really well for these ants. Like this is effectively a code they can use to tell friend from foe. It is fundamental to how they interact with one another. Disrupting that and starting, if the ants started to ignore that input, it would cause all kinds of problems in the colony. They probably, the colony would probably collapse because they would no longer have that ability to tell friend from foe. So most of the time, it's a highly advantageous system. It's just in this particular case, it's being exploited, but, it's kind of a cost-benefit analysis. Maybe you get exploited some of the time by these darn caterpillars, but on the whole, it's beneficial to the colony to be relying on these particular signals. That's, I think, a nice argument for it. Kristen, did you have was that a stretch or did you have a, no, okay. Anybody have any other explanations for like why, could be, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, you'd almost have to have them like pre-selected, where the ant colony would have to already be somehow not paying attention to the signal before the caterpillar ever shows up. That makes, I think, is an argument. So sometimes those are called like pre-adaptations, where there's, for some other reason, the colony starts to use other signals. And then at that point, they are resistant to caterpillars, but it might be hard to kind of do it simultaneously because these are so problematic. Sean, did you have another thing, or nope. Same deal? Yeah. So like these clearly are, well, yeah. Let me finish that thought. The often do collapse, therefore. I think if the colony collapse was happening a lot, so if there were just colony after colony after colony that was getting wiped out by these things, and the selection pressure was really, really high, then I think you probably still would expect at some point these caterpillars would evolve some kind of resistance to it. But if it's a relatively rare thing, then it could be that it's, just, again, most of the time maybe this is still a productive signaling system for them to have, but there's some small percentage of the time when it just totally gets fouled up because you get this invader that comes in. Sometimes we see situations like this when we do see a parasite or a predator that is causing severe losses on a population. Sometimes that's because that's a new invading species, so you may have an invasive species that you're dealing with. So if these ants had never really encountered these blue butterfly caterpillars before, they may just still be in the process of evolving some kind of resistance. So I guess I'll put that as a third one. May also just not have evolved yet, but may in the future, depending on what's going on. So I think there's kind of like it could be that there's just sort of a cost-benefit equilibrium that you've reached where, yeah, sometimes you get exploited, but most of the time it's good. But it could also be, actually, this is a real problem, but you need to let selection happen. So we need to allow time for the appropriate variants to occur within the population. And then after that, you may see some shift in the behavior of the animals. We'll talk about this kind of thing again in a few chapters when we start talking about adaptations and why some adaptations seem to be imperfect oftentimes, which seems to be the case in this situation for the ants. Any other comments, questions on this? Let's talk 4. So 4 is asking about these weird little cortical maps. And we did kind of talk about this in class, but the question is, in what ways do these cortical maps or representations support the argument that animal brains exhibit adaptive sensory biases? So this one went to Kayla. What'd you put? I'm going to throw lips in there too. Yeah, so these maps are basically trying to depict how much of the brain is dedicated to processing sensory information from each of these different parts of the body. So if our brain was proportional to the size of different body parts, then our brain would have, a pretty small amount of space dedicated to processing sensory stuff coming from your feet or your hands or your lips. And instead, we kind of exaggerate input coming from those areas because that's what's really important. We are very tactile animals in a lot of ways. We do a lot with our hands, and we touch and use our hands a lot. And therefore, we need a lot of brain power dedicated to processing input from our hands. So that literally, there's like a larger swath of brain dedicated to processing your hand than there is to processing like all of your entire leg, despite the fact that your hand is so much smaller than your leg. Similarly, we get a lot of input from going into our lips because that's where we experience food. But I think probably even more important is language. So we do so much with our lips and our tongue. It's not shown on here, but the tongue is also really exaggerated. And I think we need that sensory capacity with our tongue and our lips in order to properly form words. And that's part of the reason we have such strong sensory density in that area. So we have a lot of touch receptors in our mouth. And we can kind of tell the importance of that if you ever go to the dentist and you get Novocaine and you can't feel your mouth, and all of a sudden you're like trying to talk, and you're just like, you're drooling, but you just can't form words anymore because you don't have the ability to feel what your tongue and lips are doing, at least temporarily. So this is the idea, is that we're not just going to treat every part of our bodies the same. We will tend to allow brains, and all animals do this, they will specialize in processing certain sensory areas of their bodies because that's the most relevant and important to them. And different animals will look different in that regard. All right, then we got, the last one is 5. So this is kind of a multi-parter. 5A, this went to Gracie, asked about the pictures of the daisies. I wanted to pull it up, so we pull each of these up. Sorry, give me a sec. I'll get there. I just need to make sure I'm not being unproductive. Here they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've been described almost like runway lights or something. And I think the thing that you always have to remember is that this is just one kind of a color that these animals are perceiving. We can't see it. We actually have filters in our corneas that filter out ultraviolet radiation. So people that actually have our corneas removed for various reasons will sometimes perceive different, like some new colors that they couldn't really see before, and that's often ultraviolet. But humans can't see ultraviolet light, but many animals can, including these butterflies. And so butterflies will hone in on these kinds of signals. A lot of birds can see ultraviolet as well. So hummingbirds, for example, will also pay attention to these kinds of ultraviolet colors. And it would probably just look like a really deep violet kind of a color, I guess, to them. It's kind of hard to imagine. It's something we can't perceive. So like, how do you describe what that would look like to them? And then in this case, we've got these cool little butterflies. My PhD advisor is actually this guy, Ron Rotowski. So this was one of his main subjects. I didn't work on them directly too much, but this is Coleus eurythemi, and so these are males, these are females, and these males have this really bright iridescence. And it looks like it's only on one wing because these are almost like little mirrors. So in this case, the light was coming from like this direction. The camera was here, and it was bouncing off this wing and hitting this camera. If we put a light on the other side, then this wing would light up. And so as the butterfly beats its wings, it kind of flashes ultraviolet. It's kind of neat. I'm not going to write anything because I think we hit that well. What about figure 416? So this is part B. This went to Adam. Let me pull up the figure. This one. Yep. So where is Adam? Oh, there you go. What'd you put? No, you're fine.
I said they compared the filters
Yeah, so here we've got unfiltered light. So this is just light coming down from the sky, and you find under those circumstances that when they were doing these experiments, these monarchs were kind of in migration mode, and they would orient mostly here, which is kind of southwestish, right? If you expose them to light, but you added a polarizing filter such that the only light that could come in was vertical oriented light, and this is hard to perceive because we can't see polarized light, but they apparently can. So in this case, the light is coming along the vertical axis. That means like all the light waves are oscillating in the same direction along this vertical axis. They continue to fly in that same direction. So this is indicative that our filter in this case, this vertical filter, matched the normal orientation of light out here. But when you add the horizontal filter, that basically is altering by about 90 degrees the orientation of light in the environment. And so now the only light that's hitting them is coming down in along this other direction. And so what they do is they basically just shift their direction about 90 degrees because they're using that apparently as some kind of a compass cue. So here, instead of flying southwest, now they're flying, northwest or so, because they're getting a different set of information now from the light that's coming down on them because you've shifted the polarization axis. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of a weird experiment just to get your head wrapped around like what is polarized light, and because we can't see it. But again, it's this idea that if you look up in the sky, if you have polarized sunglasses, for example, and you start twisting the polarization filter, so you're looking at them like, if you take your glasses like this, and then if you alter them like this, you'll see some differences in the light intensity in the sky, and that will be oriented along an axis that sort of traces back up to where the sun is. And apparently they can use that information to figure out where the sun is, and as a result, which way is north versus south versus east, or east versus west. And so if you start messing with it like you did here in this experiment, they will alter their direction because they're perceiving differences in navigation signals. What about C? This is kind of speculative, or I don't know. I don't quite know how to describe that question, but I like it. So given the fact that we have these animals that have differences in human perceptive abilities, what does that mean for us when we're trying to experiment? So this went to you, Jessica. What did you put? Yeah. So at least we have to always keep in mind that what we see is not necessarily what the animals see. So visual experiments, I think, there's sort of a chronic issue because our visual capacity is different from that of a lot of other organisms. We have very good vision. We have good color vision. We don't see the ultraviolet. We're really good at telling different colors apart, though, compared to a lot of mammals. Another great example of this is I remember there was an experiment on a fly where they were trying to show a fly kind of a video of like a shape moving because they were trying to study something about perception on a TV. But the problem was that flies have they have a higher refresh rate in their visual system than we do, so they can see shorter blinks individually. So like when we look at a normal television monitor and we see motion on the screen, we see it as like continuous motion. They see it as individual frames because effectively their eyes work faster than ours do. And so all they would see, that they were trying to show a video to them, and instead what they were presented with was like a series of pictures in a row. And lo and behold, the animal didn't respond to it as if it was motion. It responded to it as if it was just some pictures flashing on the screen in front of them. So you have to kind of be aware of that. And the only reason they figured that out is because they were recording from electrodes where they'd see their, these individual peaks each time the frame came up. Even though to a human, at 60 hertz, we can't see those individual frames. It all sort of blurs together for us. So we have to be cognizant that animals may not perceive things the way that we're perceiving them. And we need to try to control for that as best we can. Okay, well, dad burn it. So we're out of time. I think these are good things. I'm glad we went through this. It was a good discussion. What I want to do on Thursday is I still am hoping that we'll have a chance to start in the homework. So I do want you to do the homework again for Thursday. We'll get ourselves caught up at some point here. But I think that's the main thing for Thursday, is to do the homework assignment for Thursday. And then I will be giving out the exams on Thursday right after class. It'll be set to reveal to you at that time. All right, so I will see you guys then. We'll hope that the flies come out.